Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for the next webinar in the Ethnic and Racial Issues Committee's Anti-Racist Series, Becoming an Ally and Co-Conspirator in Developmental Science. My name is Nigasi Dawi, and I'm the Senior Policy Associate at the Society for Research in Child Development. On behalf of the Society for Research in Child Development, thank you for joining us for what will be an engaging discussion exploring allyship and becoming a co-conspirator in the context of developmental science. The first webinar in the series, Becoming an Anti-Racist Society, Setting a Developmental Research Agenda, was a call to action for the developmental science community. One of the critical pieces underlying the implementation of such an agenda is understanding the supports necessary to foster inclusive and equitable environments for those who contribute to, support, or apply developmental science to benefit human lives. Today's webinar will explore how to build on efforts to dismantle longstanding structures that have contributed to scholarship that does not capture the lived experiences of intersectional, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or minoritized individuals. The panelists will begin the webinar with introductions and a framing for further discussion. Panelists will then engage in a discussion about 3 overarching questions during the first hour. Remarks will then be followed by a Q&A session during the last portion of the webinar. Thanks to those of you who posted great questions when you registered. We also invite attendees to submit questions for the panelists via the Q&A box in the Zoom toolbar located at the top or bottom of your screen. And we will do our best to address as many of the questions during the Q&A session as time permits. If you run into technical issues, please send us a message describing the issue that you're experiencing via the Q&A box, and we will do our best to address the issue. SRCD is dedicated to providing a harassment-free experience for everyone. We ask that all attendees be mindful of inclusivity and respect for persons and their conduct, making every effort to frame discussions as openly and inclusively as possible. This webinar is being recorded. We will post the webinar on our website, www.srcd.org. On that note, today we are joined by 6 experts, Drs. Lionel Howard, Mona Abo-Zena, Diamond Bravo, Gabriela Chavira, Mariah Contreras, and Hyung Chol, Brandon Yu. Thank you all for joining us for this discussion. Can you please each tell us a little bit about yourself?
Good afternoon, everyone, for attending today's webinar. Before we do introductions, I'd like to start by first appreciating Nigasi for her support in making sure that we were able to get this webinar off the ground. And we also like to start more formally introducing ourselves later on in the program. So we're going to start with the land acknowledgement first.
Although we gather virtually, we would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the unceded territory of Indigenous peoples. Recognizing that territorial boundaries are fluid and that documentation is disputed, the interactive map provides a resource to help identify and acknowledge the past, present, and future Native custodians of the land on which we work, live, and travel. While land acknowledgements are important to integrate into our personal and institutional practices, they are particularly salient now as we teach and celebrate fall holidays. For all its positive features, we note that the United States was built on 2 injustices: the attempted genocide of Indigenous peoples and the enslavement of Black people from Africa. On the brink of what feels like a very needed Thanksgiving break, we acknowledge that Indigenous people and their allies may instead mark a national day of mourning because, as the monument in Plymouth, Massachusetts reads, Thanksgiving is a reminder of the genocide of millions of Indigenous people, the theft of their lands, and the relentless assault on their culture. Participation in the National Day of Mourning honors Native ancestors and the struggles of Native peoples to survive today. In solidarity, each panelist acknowledges the Native custodians of the land for our respective academic institutions, noting the continued culpability of land-grant institutions. In reflecting on land acknowledgements, please ask yourself, am I familiar with the practice of acknowledging Indigenous land? If so, how did I learn? Personally, I learned relatively recently by inquiring about the land acknowledgement in the email signature of a colleague, which began my own overdue yet intentional steps to learn and do more. What are the reasons for the visibility or invisibility of this simple yet power-noting practice? The practice of acknowledging Indigenous land recognizes the unjust nature of settler colonialism. While it does not actively remediate injustices to Indigenous peoples, it still serves important functions. 1, Individuals and institutions who acknowledge Indigenous land and people provide an invaluable mirror, indicating that we see and are trying to ally with Indigenous people. 2, it provides an entry point to learn about and engage with the particular Indigenous groups in your community and join current efforts to uplift and remedy injustices. So please check out the interactive map. And 3, it acknowledges and resists the enduring effects of settler colonialism, which is necessary to decolonize our thinking and practices. While land acknowledgements are becoming common in some spaces, an unfortunate side effect is that they border on becoming a formality rather than a meaningful practice. I remind myself and invite you to guard against complacency and identify steps in your circles of influence to link awareness to action.
Before starting our conversation today, it's important to have consensus on the expectations or rules for appropriate engagement. For many of us, the demands to create safe spaces to discuss race, racism, and other systems of power have been largely overlooked, further privileging whiteness and white people and their experiences. We seek to challenge the notion of, for whom is the world safe? Instead, as co-conspirators, we invite you all to engage in powerful conversations about power and oppression and lean into a healthy amount of uncertainty and discomfort. We know that learning can take us beyond our usual comfort zone, but this is really part of the process. Our goal here is to create a safe space for everyone, which means a space that is actively anti-racist and inclusive. We've stated some norms for courageous conversations with language adapted from the book and from Brown University peer educators. Collectively, we're asking participants to stay engaged, listen to the full extent of their capacities, and we also ask that you expect and accept the lack of closure. This again is part of the ongoing dialogue and the efforts that are needed to make substantial change. We also ask that you take, make, and brave spaces for all voices, especially those that are typically unheard. We ask that participants speak their truth and use I statements. Also expect and notice the discomfort in this process. Make sure that you care for yourself and others. And next, don't yuck my yum. Or in other words, if you don't agree or like everything, that's fine, but we do ask for respectful engagement. And finally, we ask that together we trust the intent and intentionality, but hold ourselves accountable to naming the impact of our actions. Now, because we're learning to navigate safe spaces virtually, it's also important to consider the virtual context in which we're interacting today. Virtual safety must be prioritized. And so for that reason, some of us have made the conscious and collective decision to engage in this webinar off camera. In solidarity with those who may be afraid of being identified, judged, or located, we hope to model a virtual environment that is safe and inviting for all participants, including panelists.
Audre Lorde said, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare." How do you define self-care? For people with privileged identities, self-care is generally celebrated and may take the form of meditation, exercise, or just taking a break. For others, it may be considered indulgent or with skepticism because it violates an implicit norm. So like Diamond said, we wanted to provide more context for why in a professional seminar, some of us have opted to keep our cameras off. I've intentionally set a boundary of not streaming video as a form of self and community care and in solidarity with students, faculty, and staff for whom video streaming inhibits our full participation. We may be distracted by others in our care or share our space or did not or cannot legally provide consent to be seen and possibly captured by video or camera. People like children, foster children, family and friends, nursing mothers. Requiring or even expecting a cameras on approach insists on monitoring that exerts a power dynamic that I do not want to collude in. Critical groups widely agree that professional standards of dress and presentation advantage males and folks who have the time and material resources to curate particular physical and virtual spaces. This disenfranchises women, BIPOC, non-binary, and other highly surveilled immigrant origin, racially minoritized and religious communities. Well-intentioned folks in virtual meetings ask, Will we get a chance to see you, pressuring us to disclose or find creative ways to step around mental or physical health issues, or our general desire to avert the gaze, to avoid the male gaze, the white gaze, or the colonial gaze, all during an extended pandemic where our personal and professional boundaries are collapsing? Quite simply, seeing my image makes me feel self-conscious and distracted by my own self-presentation. I'm slouching, my scarf looks weird. Then they ask me if I'm aware that I can hide viewing my own video while still projecting it to others. I consider the flip side. Can you help me understand how having the camera on contributes to our work substantively? We all have experienced the unstable internet connection. Perhaps having less video to transmit, particularly with multiple internet users in the same space, may actually strengthen our virtual connection to the meeting. These are difficult times that we are all navigating in the best way we can. So for now, please respect that I am fully present with my camera off. Lionel?
Thank you, Mona. Thank you, Daima, for setting those ground rules and expectations and just modeling for all of us. As Nahisti noted, this webinar is part of a series and continues the conversation and work of our colleagues who convened the first webinar on anti-racism in June. This afternoon, we offer an opportunity for you to consider what it means to be and how you can work towards becoming an ally and co-conspirator within the field of developmental science. We appreciate that you may be entering this conversation from different vantage points, and we hope to provide a range of perspectives from which you can begin or continue your understanding and move towards action. This webinar is organized around a set of questions that panelists will consider, offering perspectives based on their lived experience, including personal and professional, within the field and as developmental scientists. We invite you to also consider the organizing questions and to resist the urge to solely place your focus on the panelists. The objective is for you to experience resonance through our sharing and actively consider how you contribute to and can work to dismantle systems of oppression in your respective roles and capacities. To begin this afternoon's conversation, it's important to offer some grounding definitions, specifically how we define allyship and co-conspirator. Allyship is often posed as a noun, an ally, or as a verb. We choose to use the term allyship to indicate a verb as in action in the process of becoming. So with that in mind, allyship is an active, consistent, and arduous practice of unlearning and reevaluation in which a person in a position of privilege and power seeks to operate in solidarity with the marginalized group. Allyship is not an identity. Rather, it's an ongoing process of becoming. It is not self-defined. Rather, a recognition by the people we seek to ally ourselves with. Similarly, co-conspirator we conceive as a verb, an action. A co-conspirator takes an active role in dismantling structures that oppress an individual or group. A co-conspirator forfeits or leverages power and privilege to transform our societal conditions. A co-conspirator takes responsibility for the power that we hold to transform our conditions. He, she, they, the co-conspirator, understands how whiteness and privilege work in our society and leverage their power, privilege, and resources in solidarity with justice movements to dismantle white supremacy. You will hear these terms throughout the webinar as they center the questions we take up as a panel. To begin our conversation, I'm going to invite the panelists to introduce themselves. So I will lead off in my introduction. My name is Lionel Howard, and I'm Associate Professor at George Washington University. I am trained in the field of developmental psychology and human development, and my training was located in a graduate school of education and human development. I am also trained as a statistician and have done critical educational ethnography. I think of myself as a developmental psychologist and a methodologist. My scholarship takes up questions around race, gender, and the intersection of the two. I'm specifically interested in the ways in which masculinity is socialized amongst Black boys. When I think about allyship and being a co-conspirator within the context of the profession, I'm often thinking about the ways in which I exist on the periphery of the field. As someone who was not trained in a traditional psychology department, I'm often questioning whether I fully belong in this space, largely because I take up different epistemologies and different theories to guide my inquiry. I am interested in critical conversations, critical theories, critical methodologies that often feel counter to the developmental science space. I remember very clearly as a postdoctoral fellow in a psych department, giving a presentation and having a difficult time trying to make clear to the audience the rigor of the methodologies that I take up to do my inquiry. As someone who does ethnographic research in a largely quantitative post-positivist space, you can often feel like an outsider. Yet it was in that moment that I was even more clear about why methodology that I use is so critical and needed in the field. It raised questions about rigor, validity, trustworthiness. It also made me think about where my work would be published and received. When I flip through the journals of child development and other like journals, it is not often that I see ethnographic or critical ethnographic research. As a consequence, it makes me wonder what impact can I have on the field and trying to find alternative space. At the same time, I try to think about how can I push the field to do more, to be more expansive, to think about what's not familiar. So in my work in the field, I try to encourage and support researchers to think about different methodologies that might be more instructive, instrumental in understanding child development. This might mean actually going into the field, into communities, talking to actual people. One of the challenges I often experience is when people become experts, especially on Black children, and have never spoken to a Black child or Black parents, yet have a quite robust publication list that centers the Black child development. It makes me wonder, what are we really understanding about these communities? How might we sort of think about different ways of doing the research? As a Black, queer identified, cisgender male, I occupy multiple marginalized spaces. And I take great responsibility in making sure that as I'm navigating these different spaces, that I'm also pushing those spaces to be more inclusive and more expansive. I try to think about different ways in which we might train students to take what I would call more risk to do more community-based research, where it's not always as straightforward, and you may have to relinquish the control and the power of the lead researcher to really work in collaboration and concert with the communities you hope to serve. So I hope that through this webinar, you'll have a chance to think about how you take up research, the epistemologies that you hold, and to challenge your training if it limits the ways in which you take up this work.
I'm Mona Abo-Zena, and I grew up in a small town in Iowa with the only other Muslim people living with me, my own family. Growing up, I recall mouthing the words to Christmas carols through elementary school, and learning to do so in Spanish in middle and high school. Like many youth with minoritized identities, I struggled to holistically embrace my own immigrant origin and religiously minoritized identity, and that was before 9/11. As an educator in pre-K to middle school contexts, I wanted to foster learning communities that validated all aspects of my students' identities and experiences, often motivated by my own childhood memories of marginalization and pseudo-acceptance. While co-facilitating a Seeking Educational Equity and Diversity, or SEED seminar in my public school, I had the opportunity to be mentored by Peggy McIntosh and Emmy Howe, two white women who introduced me to ways educators could identify our own experiences of otherness and oppression and build bridges to understand the experiences of others. I use those same personal entry points in my anti-oppression work now in higher education developmental science contexts. I model slides like the one I've shown in my own teaching. Starting with Paulo Freire's quote, "I cannot be a teacher without exposing who I am," I reflect on my own come from places, socially, ideologically, and experientially. I highlight how engaging with folks whose stories are both similar to and different from mine become integrated into who I am becoming and partnering with.
Hi, my name is Gabriela Chavira, and I am a Chicana professor of psychology at Cal State University, Northridge, the land of the Fernandino Tatavian. I use critical race theory and other critical theories to study the contextual factors through which immigrant Latinx youth navigate, contributing to their transition to adulthood. I was drawn to developmental science because of the lack of diversity within the field. As a daughter of immigrants and first-generation undergraduate student, I didn't see myself and my experiences reflected in the textbooks or in my class discussions. The literature described minoritized families and youth through deficit lenses. Any deviation from white norms were looked as less than or negative in developmental outcomes, such as infants of working moms and ethnic minorities being described as less likely to be securely attached, minoritized parents incorrectly depicted as authoritarian and less authoritative, and their children were less likely to have optimal outcomes. As an emerging scholar, reviewers were constantly asked for comparison groups, meaning white. So my purpose became to decenter and move away from the white norm so that differences could be just that, different, not better or worse. And we could also focus on similarities.
Hi everyone, my name is Diamond Bravo and I'm a Latina. I'm also a first-generation Mexican origin, US born, queer identified, cis female, private school educated daughter of immigrants. And my pronouns are she, her, ella. Currently, I work as a second-year assistant professor of developmental psychology at the University of California, Riverside, which also happens to be my undergraduate alma mater. My academic trajectory was inspired by the aspirations of my family, who worked to ensure that I would earn a rewarding career. These aspirations began in the strawberry fields, where my grandparents worked for over 30 years to pave the way for the new and unknown opportunities. And now, after having completed over 25 years of education, which includes a bachelor's degree in psychology with a minor in women's studies, a master's degree in experimental psychology, a doctorate in family and human development, and a postdoctoral fellowship, I've come back full circle with the intention of filling a gap, a very visible gap in academia. Having attended a Hispanic serving institution at the start of my college experience was both something that was exciting and confusing, although I never actually met faculty that shared even remotely similar life experiences to my own, other than, of course, residing in the same state. And throughout this long journey, I've encountered many unknowns, and I've been uplifted by many lifetime mentors, a majority of which were women of color, including Dr. Chavira, who's a panelist here today. My experiences within developmental science have been almost like an outsider, learning about a system and a field that was not designed to support or train people like myself. And these experiences, I'm often told what being Mexican origin means and how to do this work with the population that I belong to. And in truth, developmental science didn't start to make sense until I learned about critical and cultural epistemologies, or frameworks that name and give weight to the experiences of people of color, underscoring intersections of systems of oppression and cultural resiliencies, over and above the tired deficit views and assumptions that were fed from the beginning of time. And so today, these are the frameworks that guide my work.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this space. My name is Hyung Chol, although everyone sort of calls me Brandon. I also want to sort of acknowledge that I don't find myself to be an expert in being a co-conspirator, rather more of a learner in terms of trying to keep myself open in the learning process and to be able to try to understand when and where and how I can sort of step up and stand with the people that I care for and want to co-conspirate with. I primarily self-identify as an immigrant, Asian American, cisgender, straight, and able-bodied. And I want to acknowledge the privilege of my viewpoints often centering race over my other privileged identities. In these spaces and in my work, I try to consistently reflect and take action and what it means to disrupt privileged narratives to be more inclusive, I was born in Seoul, South Korea, and immigrated at the age of 5. And I grew up in Orlando, Florida, in a predominantly white community space and with people where I hardly felt like I belonged. Throughout my life, I've always questioned my sense of belonging that feeds into my imposter syndrome. And I've continually struggled and challenged in what that means in my academic work. As a co-conspirator in academia, I often think about the visibility of bodies and perspectives in our research, teaching, and service, and in what is required of us to create space for, support, and center the needs and the lived experiences of our BIPOC students and community. So I look forward to today's conversation, and thank you very much.
I just want to thank the panelists for your introductions. It's important for our guests to understand our social locations, the epistemologies that we occupy and use, and also to appreciate that we are actively working in this space in a time where our country is deeply divided around many issues. And so as we take up these questions, we ask that the attendees really sort of create space for the vulnerability that we may display as we talk about or respond to the different set of questions. So with that being said, let's turn to our formal conversation by taking up the 3 questions that organize this webinar. I'd like to start with the first question. How do you understand allyship and being a co-conspirator within the context of research, teaching, mentorship, and service? I'd like to begin with Mona, if you wouldn't mind beginning us in this conversation.
Thanks, Lionel. Brandon, I really resonated with your point about, questioning expert and thinking about a learner or a striver. My understanding of allyship and co-conspiracy in scholarship is rooted in self-work, using windows and mirrors to magnify how lived experiences affect our development, and Frere's notion of working with, not for. I tell my students, many of whom are prospective educators or working in community contexts, that it's hard to partner with people when you're looking down at them. I've also learned to ask myself and students, who have I been taught to look down on? What aspects of my own identity have I been socialized to dislike or be ashamed of? How can I rid myself and my practices of these oppressive messages? It's dangerous to engage in co-conspiring work without self-work. This self-work requires us to reflect on ugly realities, confronting our own biases, looking at our limited experiences. We should sustain ourselves and others by being generous and increasingly accountable while being critical of systems. As Peggy McIntosh says, there should be no blame, shame, or guilt for our identities, but we should be intentional and restorative about how we use our privilege to challenge asymmetrical power arrangements and redistribute power equitably. Learn signs of complacency, like I can't help it if I'm or was born, and instead strengthen your resolve and plan to critically co-develop action plans. For me, this version is always under construction, a becoming that is rooted in being humble, curious, asking for feedback, and learning to ask questions in an inquiry-based, non-judgmental way. I try to replace microaggressions of dismissing or ignoring a point that is unfamiliar to me with a micro-affirmation. That's an interesting perspective. Can you tell me more about why that's important to you? In my research, teaching, and mentoring, I highlight the lived experiences of students to help provide windows and mirrors. As Emily Stile writes, half the curriculum walks in the room with students in the textbooks of their lives. Start in class with, what do you know about getting dumped? Or describe an experience you have had with police. Provides entry points to connect learned and lived experiences. In the academy, these are particularly important mirrors for BIPOC folks and people with experiences that are underrepresented or marginalized. I connect lived experiences with analyzing or when analyzing developmental theories, including their main points, evaluating strengths and limitations of the empirical foundations, and when possible, including photos of theorists. For example, as we wrap up critiques of the largely non-inclusive science that guides widespread developmental expectations for infants' motor development, I introduced Dr. Margaret Beal Spencer's PVEST model with her statements highlighted. Flaw 1, context ignored. Flaw 2, racism ignored. Flaw 3, general lack of a developmental perspective when considering youth of color, i.e. all races. We discussed the implications of her terminology using terms like diverse and color to include the experiences of white youth, decentering, like Gabby mentioned earlier, how whiteness is often represented as normative. I explicitly tell students, if you read a textbook or article that focuses on negative attributes of a group you are a member of or learning about, don't believe the hegemony of the text. We talk about the need to look both ways, like Cynthia Garcia Cole and colleagues modeled, to consider developmental challenges as well as competencies. When studies explore effects by race or gender, we draw from work by Janet Helms and colleagues that argue that using race or other social address variables as independent predictors is conceptually meaningless, particularly given intersectional identities. Rather, as researchers, we need to be conceptually and methodologically precise. As a class, we introduce nuances from their lived experiences to counter the deficit or reductionistic assumptions. Dedicating learning time to sharing variations in our life texts provides students with windows into the nuances of other people's lived experiences. Over a semester, this proximity provides an opportunity to believe and weigh the import of experiences we may not have previously imagined. Having students think about their lived experiences and how they are or not reflected in developmental scholarship helps teach critical analysis. I model the simple equity practice of asking, who or what did we leave behind? Who may be represented, but in a way that they may not prefer? I offer choice in assignments so students can take more leadership in their learning. For example, one Black female student in an introductory human development class regularly chatted with me after class about egregiously racist and reductionistic language she noticed in our textbook. We started brainstorming a meaningful final project for her. In communication with the publisher, her final coursework produced a draft outlining a few key areas of imprecise or oppressive descriptions and providing alternative framing that she later shared with the publisher. As co-conspirators engaged in applied work, I encourage and model drawing from our power to reshare underrepresented experiences as valid experiences, like ethnographies. I encourage students to take what they are learning and apply in their everyday lives with peers, with families, coworkers, and as they insert themselves into producing scholarship.
Thank you, Mona. I think you've given us, in some ways, indication or insight into your philosophy of teaching and sort of naming the different sources that exist that you draw on in leading your classes. So thank you for that response. I'm going to invite Brandon, if you'd like to comment as well.
So lately, I've been thinking a lot about the work of Grace Lee Boggs. She's a first-generation Asian American feminist and an activist who importantly contributed to the Black Power and Asian American movement. In particular, she said, you cannot change any society unless you take responsibility for it, unless you see yourself as belonging to it and responsible for changing it. For me, the sense of belonging begins with learning, but more importantly, unlearning our own personal and group's history. As an Asian American, I have to consistently learn and unlearn my group's history. By unlearning, I do not mean to discard or forget, but to acknowledge and challenge all the things that were imposed on us and on me. I always have to remind myself of this and how we as BIPOC and minoritized groups in academia, like elsewhere, are regularly made invisible or relegated to the periphery of our spaces and field. So in being a co-conspirator in research, for example, I look for opportunities to create space for and value different theories and methodologies, to recognize how my research may reproduce white supremacy, and trying to do research that better centers the lived experiences and empower minoritized communities that are often rendered invisible. To illustrate, my research focuses primarily on the unique racialized risk, resiliency, and more recently, resistance by Asian Americans. I started to create measures like the subtle and blatant racism scale for Asian Americans, or the internalization of the modern minority myth, focused on, for, and by Asian American lived experiences of race and racism, to scientifically validate our existence, pain, struggle with race, and racism, to hope that our research can quote unquote impact and improve the lives of our community. However, even in this area of research on race and racism in psychology, I can see how racism and white supremacy reproduces itself. Namely, it is often in the positivist viewpoint that we believe as scientists that our community is immune, namely, it is often in the positivist viewpoint that we believe as scientists that our work is immune to how we quote unquote objectively understand and interpret the lived experiences of people we study. Even in our quantitative work, how might our positionality situated in a particular community inform our research process, interpretation, and more importantly, the biases? I also often wonder what it means to center our communities in our research. How does the research process itself, from asking the research question to the dissemination, focus on our minoritized communities? Research and ways of doing research need to include and be rewarded multiple ways of knowing and studying it. We need to emphasize non-hierarchical relationships, building trust, and building with what already exists in our communities. We need to focus on partnership investments and the direct benefits to our community in which we live in, and to not be extractive. We need to always ask, who benefits from the research that we do? Can we increase opportunities, institutions, grants, awards that center partnership and agency of communities and community organizations, not only addressing equity and justice, but also the work of coalitions and the co-conspirator work needed? In relation to social justice, how can we use our research to continually offer counter narratives, agency, and empowerment of our minoritized groups, and tools to dismantle, challenge, and disrupt white supremacy? Also, how can we use our research as an opportunity to build power in minoritized communities, such as using data to fuel demands for social change? What are the psychological implications of coalition building and solidarity work situated in our group's history and lived experiences? So these are some of the beginning questions for me.
Thank you so much for that, Brandon. I just want to highlight two things that really resonated with me. One is this idea that we are, as we're even trying to disrupt and dismantle, we have to exist within. And sort of the challenge of being in that space, trying to make those kinds of changes. The second thing is this idea of looking at ourselves and our communities that we occupy, right? And how we might need to unlearn some things so that we might be allies or co-conspirators for other groups, right? But also to appreciate that there are nuances that exist within our communities. Gabriela, I'd like to invite you to respond to the question. I'm sorry, Bravo.
Thank you, Lionel. So for me, my understanding of allyship and being a co-conspirator also revolves around this notion of unlearning. And so for myself, it's been, I don't know that I necessarily identify as an expert, but rather a learner. And so in this process, I really gravitate to this notion of teaching to unlearn. So throughout my lived experiences, I was always taught that if you work hard, you will succeed. It's something that's inevitable. But now I've learned that there's so much more to that. To succeed as a minoritized individual, you also need to feel empowered, and you need aspirations, and you need mentors, and you need information, you need community, and you need to belong. And so for this reason, I make it a point to center my research and teaching on the immeasurable value of resilience and the often unacknowledged assets, coined community cultural wealth by Dr. Terioso, that really serve to empower minoritized individuals. This work also means engaging in difficult critical conversations that label the asymmetry in power dynamics. These are the kinds of conversations that expose what's called the hidden and often problematic curriculum that is ever present in academia and many other institutions. This is a hidden curriculum that is one that I've been piecing together since the start of my academic career, and of course have better understood through the eyes and continued support of lifetime mentors. Without them, I'm not sure that it would have made as much sense. And these lifetime mentors shared that the curriculum can silence, exclude, and hinder reproducing the inequalities that, despite the hoops we've already jumped, we have to continue to work through. And so by continuing the tradition of sharing the hidden curriculum and sharing early, minoritized students and scholars can develop the skills that are needed to tackle these unstated rules. And so part of that hidden curriculum for me includes letting students know what to expect, how to deal with specific situations, and how to see and focus on the big picture so that the costs don't outweigh the benefits of their experience within academia. For me, an important part of the hidden curriculum included finding my voice and knowing how and when to use it. It's always striking to me that as an academic, we're trained in theories, methodologies, and the dissemination of our work, but we aren't trained in how to take up space using our voice, how to connect and engage with audiences and groups that are completely different from ourselves. Even now, as scholars and community members, we can all engage in some form of activism by sharing the wealth of knowledge and experiences, by naming the process, and by being authentic in the vulnerability throughout the process. This is something that I consider as valuable in empowering minoritized individuals and community members. And sort of along with this spirit of teaching to unlearn, and a theme that my colleagues have already been presenting, I think, beyond exposing the hidden curriculum, it's also important that we move beyond this sole prioritization of productivity, right? When engaging in research, teaching, and mentorship, it's not often the case that we focus on the holistic experiences that individuals have, right? Instead, where we've been institutionally and culturally conditioned and socialized to take a capitalistic approach, right? So the number of publications, the impact factor, the funding amount, yes, all of these things are great, but we also forget to prioritize the things that many of us take for granted: managing stress, well-being, health, and of course, the overall quality of life. These are just the basic necessities that are crucial to the road of persistence in academia and other institutions. But again, often just the last consideration. And so for me, it's important that we acknowledge the need for minoritized students and individuals to have safe spaces where they can articulate their needs and where they can establish a sense of belonging, because the quality of these experiences really leaves a long-lasting impression.
Thank you, Diamond. I think you've given us a lot to consider in your response to this question. As you were speaking, I couldn't help but just to hold on to the unlearning that you named and the importance of that and sort of serving as an ally or co-conspirator. And I think that speaks nicely to earlier comments that Mona made about mirrors and windows, really looking at ourselves and our students and the communities that we research as sources of knowledge. And so there's a lot to do here. And then lastly, I'll note sort of this importance of wholeness, right? How do we sort of take up the work as developmental scientists, trying to secure, quote unquote, the academic currency, right? And maintain our full selves and to take care of ourselves in doing this very important work. So let me move us forward and let me invite us to respond to the second guiding question. That question is, what opportunities and challenges have you experienced in your effort to be an ally and or a co-conspirator? And this time, let's start with Gabriela.
Thank you, Lionel. So I have to admit that I actually found this question quite difficult, as I automatically focused on the challenges rather than the opportunities. And it is through the counter space that we created in this group of panelists that I realized that there were indeed opportunities as well as challenges. So for opportunities, I found that as allies or co-conspirators, we get to be agents of change. We can support the successful matriculation of BIPOC students, the tenure and promotion of early career BIPOC faculty, and the career trajectories of BIPOC staff. And as change agents, we can support untenured BIPOC faculty's ideas and contributions and credit their ideas and their work. At the same time, reminding others not to appropriate their ideas as their own. Also, developmental college and university-wide service affords opportunities to serve as allies and co-conspirators for minoritized individuals and groups. This includes being vocal to name inequity, marginalization, and discrimination. Also protecting untenured BIPOC faculty by bringing up an issue in a meeting that they feel uncomfortable bringing up themselves. However, speaking up also comes with drawbacks. knowing that you will get that look, right? We all know that look from colleagues because you are speaking up about diversity issues, such as advocating to diversify the faculty, diversify the curriculum, or just issues of social justice. Think of how tiring it is to often find yourself as a lone dissenting voice on issues around curriculum, funding, or policies in the interest of students, or to be the only, for example, myself, the only Latinx faculty in a department where Latinx students make up more than half of the majors. Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel once said, "I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. And I have vowed to dismantle structural racism and to bring about equity in education." In service, we often find ourselves as a diversity representative on committees. Therefore, we may feel the additional burden to speak up for all BIPOC, low-income, first-generation, immigrant, and undocumented students. However, representing when in fact we don't represent all BIPOCs. Finally, BIPOC faculty have aspects of their identities that are often invisible in the workplace, but these intersecting identities add to our daily cognitive and physical load. Yes, we're faculty, but we are also caregivers to children and to aging parents. While not exclusive to women, those of us from immigrant backgrounds and language minorities advocate for the well-being of our parents as well. We schedule appointments, drive them to and from medical appointments, serve as translators, and much more. And we carry these obligations in silence, for we fear that we may be seen as not fully committed to our profession. Thank you. I think, Brandon, you're next.
I think when we're doing this work, often, institutionalized white spaces, trying to stand up for your own people and stand with others that are minoritized in our academic settings, we often find ourselves continuously hitting this brick wall over and over again, leaving us with racial trauma and racial battle fatigue scars. Academic institutions and colleagues who support diversity and inclusion, but never really committing to the action of change. Academic institutions and colleagues who are committed to the change, but continue to center their white fragility and white comfort. Diversity does not mean equity. When we continually see ourselves not belonging, we often have to ask ourselves, are we working hard out of fear or working hard for our passion and commitment to our community, to equity and justice? I believe a lot of us scholars of BIPOC in these moments can work out of fear, to doubt and lose our authentic selves, to isolate, and to overwork or not able to work at all. I too am familiar with this, as I recently had a panic attack and consider not being here today. However, often in these challenges of being a good co-conspirator, there are opportunities in these sacred spaces. I could not be here today if it wasn't for the brilliant and genuine people that you see here that have shared our space on this panel, as well as the so many personal and professional colleagues, friends in my life that it makes me feel like I belong. That with them in this space, I feel normalized and empowered by what they say and believe in what we can do. I realize more and more, radical self-care is not only about taking care of oneself to stay in the fight, but in a society and institution that says we do not belong, self-care is also about how we hold each other in support and accountable for one another. in order for all of us to belong. It is absolutely critical to remember that in the truest sense of belongingness, diversity and inclusion cannot happen if you do not center equity. As social inequities is not just a simple byproduct of lack of inclusion, but the power and the history of the dominant group shaping the differential lived experiences between majorities and minorities. On a final note, I want to end with the Grace Lee Boggs quote again, and I hope that it brings you some direction and guidance for me and for you in your co-conspirator work. Quote unquote, you cannot change any society unless you take responsibility for it, unless you see yourself as belonging to it and responsible for changing it.
Thank you, Brandon. I think that quote is so powerful, and I just want to sort of name and appreciate your sharing your vulnerability in sort of sharing that with our attendees. And just to underscore how sacred this space has been for us as panelists, to lean on each other, to feel affirmed in the work that we are doing, and just to hold space for each other. So thank you for your response to the question. Let me now invite Diamond to respond to the question.
Thank you, Lionel. And I'd also like to add, a special thank you to Brandon, for sharing your strength and vulnerability in this space. I think it's really a way to model authenticity. And to that extent, I think that this is actually what the work is, in being an ally and a co-conspirator. We can only really engage in this work when we're being our true authentic selves. In my life, I've navigated different spaces with multiple social identities that exist simultaneously and provide unique opportunities to learn and occupy space. As a queer identified Latina, I think it's important to share the experiences that exist at the intersection of these marginalized social identities. And so to this extent, being cognizant and vocal about my social identities, both visible and not, and getting in the habit of sharing what it's like to be at the introspection of these different identity markers is so important, right? But it's also something that makes us extremely vulnerable. And so every time that I walk into, or rather log into a classroom now with students, or engage with people outside or within my community, I always see this as opportunities to share both the visible and the invisible identities. And this exchange to me has really helped to strengthen and deepen the connections that I have within these contexts. And of course, while these are opportunities, there's also challenges within. So even in this capacity as a queer identified individual, I'm still guilty of using gender non-inclusive language. I'm sure many of us have had the experiences of walking into the room and saying, "Hi guys, how's everybody doing?" Right? It's pretty common. And so I have now had the practice of working with students in my own lab and talking about the accountability measures here, right? Talking about learning from our mistakes and owning them. And so for me, every time that we make a mistake, this is really an opportunity. And of course, it makes us vulnerable. And as someone who is identified as learning to be a co-conspirator, I think that that's okay. And so as a student and now faculty member, of course, there are always many opportunities to engage in this work. So for instance, serving on committees such as the Latino Caucus and working within my own department in the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. These have all been opportunities where we brought in unique perspectives to help push the need for inclusivity and anti-racism work. So for instance, in my department, we've made more concerted efforts to invite brown bag speakers who share in their research, methodology, and training to further advance this work. And so to this effect, these collective efforts have really been important opportunities that help us to engage with other allies and co-conspirators across different disciplines. And I think this is a really important service because it shows that we don't all need to be the experts, but we can connect with those that are, maybe more experienced or that are interpreting this work in different and unique ways. I think, again, that's really what helps to foster this sense of authenticity. And like you, Dr. Chavira, as I'm in the habit of calling you, as your former and forever mentee, I also just want to take a moment here to thank you for, all of the efforts that you've made, as somebody who can say firsthand, who experienced, the challenges that, that you have gone through. You were very authentic in that process. You shared with us, when I say us, I mean your other students, what the struggle was. You were always honest and you always stood up. You would talk to the faculties. There was an issue, and you kept everybody grounded. And so, I think that being in the space with you today is something that, we had always dreamed about. It's something that you talked about. I never thought that it would happen, but here we are. And so I just want to acknowledge that, you were the first Latina faculty that I work with. And of course, this is just, it's been a very special opportunity, a moment for me. So, I think it's important that, that I take this opportunity to say thank you, right? Because the work that you do is very meaningful. And now being a later generation scholar, I can speak to that. So thank you. And
Yeah,
of course, yeah, so I mean, the emotions are a big part of this, I think, right? So I don't want to leave that out. And, just to kind of add to that, I think it was really important to see that, we need boundaries to do this work. And Gabby, Dr. Chavira, you were always great at modeling what the emotional labor is needed to do this, right? You've always modeled self-awareness. And so this means acknowledging the different privileges and perspectives that we had. And so now I use that in my work and in my own conversations, right? Being US born, light-skinned, cisgendered, straight passing, able-bodied, and a middle-class raised individual. These are things that I consider as central to my positionality and ways that I occupy space. And so, of course, I just want to recognize that, these are very important conversations to have. And I think that it was really important for me to see my mentor hold herself accountable and prioritizing the needs of students, right? And helping them to learn how to establish boundaries, meaning time, mental and physical energy, and acknowledging that this is going to be a continuous process. And even seeing what the overwhelming experience looks like. I think that, while this has been, of course, a difficult process, and acknowledging that, even in the space of panelists and preparing for today's webinar, it's been difficult, right? But I think that by connecting together as a community, this is how we come together to interact as allies and co-conspirators. And of course, while recognizing the challenges and having these conversations, it's become an important opportunity. And so, I want to hopefully normalize that this is what the process looks like. And again, encourage folks to continue to do this work, because as you can see by the work of my mentors, again, many of which are women of color, there are fruitful outcomes. And so again, thank you.
thank you, Diamond, for that response. And really thank all the panelists just for thinking about this question. And I know we've wrestled with the deep emotion that comes with reflecting on a response to this question. And I think you've nicely illustrated both the challenges and opportunities that exist when we try to show up as an ally or as a co-conspirator, and the importance of the work, and sometimes work that's sort of unacknowledged or unvalued or undervalued, and just what it means for the students who are coming behind us. And creating a space that might be more welcoming and more whole for them. So thank you for responding to this question here. I'm going to move us on because we're running close on time here. And so we're going to turn to our third question. And at this time, I'm going to invite my colleague Brandon to sort of guide this conversation.
Thank you, Lionel. Our last question is, how might others become or sustain themselves as an ally and or co-conspirator? Let's start with Lionel, and then it'll be followed by Mona and Gabby.
Great, thank you, Brandon, for this question. So I have a couple of thoughts about what others might do to become or sustain themselves as allies or a co-conspirator. One is that I really believe that it's important for a person to be fully present and to reflect on their own biography, their own worldview, positionality, and the epistemologies that you hold, because that colors everything that you do going forward. And if you've not taken the time to really think about what those constructs or those ideas mean for how you show up in your professional work and your personal work, it will show up anyway. And oftentimes causing great harm or damage or problems for people that you intend to help and support. So taking the time to be fully present. And I think if you were paying attention, you heard in a lot of the earlier comments, the ways in which we self-author, right? So having to pay attention how my maleness shows up in spaces where I may be the minority in terms of gender, right? But being aware of how I show up as a faculty member in student space, right? So this idea of being present. And oftentimes we move through our day-to-day operating around 80% paying attention to what's happening around us and how we're navigating through spaces. And I believe that as a co-conspirator ally, you have to be critically aware of that. And there's no time to not be paying attention. I'd also offer, in terms of organizations, institutes, or foundations, funders who are trying to take up this work, to really think about the mission and visions that you espouse, right? So we often have these really well-crafted, well-intentioned statements about what we value in the work that we are doing, but it's not ever fully operationalized in ways that affect and produce material change. And so it might be an opportunity to really think about, how are we showing up as an organization? What are our commitments and how is that demonstrated in all of our activities? Whether that's thinking about how we do requests for proposals, whether that's how we think about the constellation of reviewers for grants, how we take up research. Do we involve communities as equal partners? Do we think about mentoring or partnering with other universities that don't fit our high selective criteria, that may have limited resources and facilities, right? And even when we do collaborative work, how do we think about the power dynamics in that relationship? Is it paternalistic? Do we sort of see them as equal partners in the creation and the conduct of their research? So really sort of thinking about what this means for the work that you're trying to accomplish. I would also say that this is an ongoing process. I see myself, as the others had said earlier, in this continual process of reflection and thinking about how I'm showing up and what it means for the work I'm trying to accomplish. Trying to unlearn and to learn new things. Sometimes we can get into a space where we think we've arrived and we are woke, quote unquote woke, right? And I'm always sort of hesitant when I hear people say I'm woke, because in my mind, there's more work to be done always. And if we get into the habit of saying we're woke, we might actually stop doing things. We might stop being sensitive to and paying attention to the nuances that drive our world. And so I think those are things that you can do to sort of help you sustain and become an ally or co-conspirator. I would also say, on the sustain end of this question, is that it's important to exercise self-care. So recognizing that we can't be all to everything, and setting parameters that make sense for our lives, and to be considerate and extend grace to our contemporaries who may have other competing demands. I am someone who does not have children, so I constantly think about what I'm asking of my colleagues who have children or have other family obligations, right? And making a decision how I can be supportive and take on perhaps more of the work, recognizing that they contribute in important ways, no matter how much time is allocated to the project. So really thinking about people beyond my own sort of self is the way I keep myself going forward in this work. And also, I'll just add that I'm committed to Black children's development, right? And when I look around my community, I look in my family, I think about how this work can impact their lives, how we might learn through them so that we can be in better service towards them.
Thank you, Lionel. Mona, would you like to answer the question?
Sure. I think I was concerned about time, so maybe Lionel, do you think we should maybe jump to Gabby, or how do you want to?
Yeah, perhaps if Gabriela has a point or two that we might add, and we can just continue to move forward. We are running close on time.
Okay, I'll try to make it brief. And then I go really fast, I'm sorry. So I think that there's many ways to begin your journey towards becoming an ally or co-conspirator. In my educational experiences, I only had one Chicana psychology professor who mentored me. So Diamond, you have been very fortunate. All of my other mentors were white women, and they were co-conspirators without even knowing it. As a student, they treated me with respect and valued my ideas. My wonderful mentor, Dr. Catherine Cooper, always treated me as a collaborator and as a professor in training, providing me with professional development opportunities and always providing guidance and support and love. So I challenge you to learn about how to be an ally and co-conspirator. We don't need white saviors. There's too many of those, and truthfully, saviors make us uncomfortable. So what are some low-hanging fruit, you ask? One, you can uplift the scholarship of minoritized researchers. Read their work, incorporate their work in your courses and in your publications. Recommend the scholarship of BIPOCs to colleagues, or nominate BIPOC faculty for awards. Now, the following recommendations require some heavy lifting. For BIPOC research participants, treat research participants with respect as experts. I acknowledge to the Latinx immigrant families that I seek to better understand their lived experiences. They are the expert. I am the learner. Ask the community what they want to learn or what they want to change. Seek their advice. Don't come in as the know-it-all scholar. Community members often know what they need, but we as scientists aren't open to their thoughts and ideas. Invite members of the community or community organizations to be part of the research team. Think about that as a novel idea. For BIPOC students, begin by speaking up on issues that may harm or benefit them. When you see a departmental or university-wide policy that hurts minoritized, first-gen, low-income students, do something, say something. For emerging scholars, support them by inviting them to co-author on publications with you. For BIPOC faculty, support them in meetings, especially when they are the only ones voicing dissent. Or if you don't feel comfortable, go and find out afterwards why they feel so strong about an issue. Learn about their side and experiences. Also, call out microaggressions when you see them or when you hear them. Again, these are not easy, but necessary if you are truly to become an ally. Finally, this may be the hardest one, which is make amends when you commit a microaggression. Some faculty actually avoid me because of the guilt they feel. Work through the guilt. It's okay to be uncomfortable. BIPOC faculty are always uncomfortable.
Thank you, Gabby. Those were such specific and poignant advice. I'm wondering if Diamond wanted to continue the takeaway points.
Thank you, Brendan. So I'll go quickly over some of these takeaway points as they apply to the individual level. So first, this is a type of work that requires critical and active reflection, sustained action and effort, and above all, embracing the vulnerability and finding the courage to engage and continue to engage. Part of the engagement entails working to unlearn racism and intersectional oppression. And of course, first learn by learning, and then translating that information into action. Next, avoid this notion of being a savior and instead consider how your work and interactions can serve to empower and uplift others, especially those who are more vulnerable. And another important point is to hold ourselves accountable to voice issues that may harm or benefit BIPOC students, faculty, staff, and community members. It's also important to call out microaggressions and to accept when we've committed a microaggression and to seek to make amends, because this is how we create safe spaces. And we should also remember to always ask for feedback. We won't get it right, not always, and maybe never, but the acknowledgement of the gaps in our knowledge is important for growth, right? Continuous growth, that is the mission. So on a personal note, we also have to prepare for the emotional labor required for the continuous work in progress that define allyship and co-conspirator efforts. Socially, we should also find ways to create affinity groups and spaces to process, vent, and ask questions. And finally, the structural piece involves identifying ways to collaborate in interrogating and interrupting systems of oppression. These are the actions that we as individuals can all engage in.
We also have some takeaways for faculty. First of all, support BIPOC faculty. Don't let them be the only voice. Second, uplift and make visible the scholarship of BIPOC. Read their work, incorporate it into your courses and publications, promote their scholarship, nominate them for faculty awards. Reflect on also who you collaborate with. Co-author with diverse and emerging scholars. Give credit and do not appropriate the ideas and actions authored by others. Also, evaluate your department and institutional missions and vision statements or value propositions. Are they aligned with promoting diversity and equity? These are other things for you to consider. For funders, you will find that many BIPOC scholars are motivated to conduct research that is meaningful and matters to the lives of disadvantaged communities. Encourage diverse methodological approaches in research. And as a reviewer, I always appreciate when senior faculty collaborate with diverse scholars across ethnicity, professional level, and institutions. Funders can encourage diversity of researchers by funding diverse collaborations. Also, fund dissemination and translational work. This is where we find that a lot of BIPOC faculty find their work meaningful, and it really is applicable to the lives of families, youth, of color, and others. So consider funding translational work. And finally, consider deficit language and non-inclusive approaches in requests for proposals and reviews. Also, make sure to recruit diverse reviewers. Thank you. So now we would like to invite Dr. Mariah Contreras to join us. She's going to moderate the Q&A session.
Thank you, Gabriela. As a reminder, we invite attendees to submit questions via the Q&A icon. It should be in your Zoom toolbar located either at the top or the bottom of your screen. And we realize that the panelists may not have time to address some of the questions that will be raised over the course of the webinar, but we continue to monitor the Q&A box and we'll make every effort to address all questions. And again, if you run into any technical issues, please let us know via the Q&A box. All right, so there are a few moments to all the panelists. There are a few moments in your discussion that seem to suggest that you've had more to relay and reflect on. So I will direct this to all the panelists. Are there any additional ideas or comments you want to share about becoming an ally or co-conspirator that you've not already discussed?
I can perhaps share, this is Mona Abo-Zena, that I find myself oftentimes, despite the fact that I'm very committed to praxis, to reflection and action, regularly disappointed in my own knowledge and efficacy. And I used to sort of blame myself, but then increasingly I'm realizing that this is a design feature of systems of oppression that render the systems themselves invisible or hidden, centering on the limitations of a particular person, sometimes me, or a context or a particular teacher, and not a system of education, a system of whatever the system might be, of behavior management. And so I think if we incorporate this practice of just going beyond the individual and starting to have this reflexive, like, okay, and what are the systemic implications of that? What are the systemic causes of that? And that's my entry point for changing or leveraging a new sort of plan for next steps.
I just like to add one point. I'm back on, sorry about that. I had an opportunity to begin to do some international work. More recently, I was involved in a racial equity summit that took me to Amsterdam to work with some colleagues there. And what was inspiring is that they were having some of the same conversations around allyship and being a co-conspirator in their universities and colleges. And so it was a great opportunity to sort of learn the ways in which we take up the conversation and the different sort of language that we use to talk about the very same issues. And so I do think that there is space for us to even think beyond just the boundaries of the US, but thinking about how we might be working as allies and co-conspirators around the globe, right, who are often faced with some of the same challenges that we are seeing, especially as the field tries to be more inclusive and expansive to incorporate international researchers and scientists into the work that we are doing.
If I can add to that, Lionel, I think that sort of the international component is so important in this sort of process, right? As I think about, again, with Asian Americans, often we think about racism being sort of contained within the US, that somehow whiteness only applies within this particular context. In many ways it does, but I think when you think about sort of the roles of settler colonialism, US imperialism, colonialism, among other fabrics, it's sort of systemic in the ways in which we sort of apply this, right? In terms of how we understand whiteness, but also anti-Blackness. Many Asian immigrants, for instance, including myself, I think come in already understanding what these things mean. We don't, in many ways, we learn it here, but how we understand those constructs in terms of what is white, what is anti-Black, is something that is, I think, global. And I think if in order to sort of be able to start to work at that in terms of in a co-conspirator relationship, the necessity for the international component seems particularly important. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you. So we're going to move along to the next theme, which I will actually post to Gabriela. We have a point of clarification. How would you distinguish being a savior from being an ally or co-conspirator?
That's a great question. So the saviors think that they are being an ally. That's the thing. They don't know that what they're doing is they're trying to protect you. They're trying to save you. They want to help you. But in doing so, they may not be, how do I say that? They're not really valuing your input. They don't see you as an equal. They see you as, in a way, if you really think about it, it's hierarchical, right? And so they don't see you as an equal partner. And so when it's more, when it's vertical rather than horizontal, I think that that's really where you start to really think, am I seeing this person as an equal? And if you're not, right, then I think that then you may be on the savior side, right? But they have good intentions. I think saviors are meaning to be supportive and BIPOC students, faculty, et cetera. But in the way what they're doing is they're actually oppressing.
Thank you. And we have a number of questions about allyship in the classroom experience. And so I'll pose these to Lionel and Mona and Gabriela, perhaps. Do you have suggestions for balancing the need to create space for sharing lived experience and wisdom in academic spaces while also ensuring that students are not burdened with the obligation to speak for all other people that share that particular aspect of their identity, particularly in predominantly white or middle class settings or institutions?
Right, so I'll start, and maybe my colleagues can jump in here. I would say that when I'm teaching, I like to sort of set norms for the classroom about how we participate and how we engage each other. And so we start with the frame of grace, right? So appreciating that people are coming into this classroom, into this exposure to content with different vantage points. And so as a consequence, we may have some rough moments, if you will, right? That might need some additional time allocated to unpack. And so although I tend to have a pretty structured sort of schedule and curriculum for my class meetings, I'm also open to giving pause to that, to allow for the conversations to unfold as they need to. When I'm working in a space where there are a few minoritized students in the classroom, I'm always purposeful and not singling those students out in conversation, right? I don't want them to become the gaze of white students to help them understand whatever topics that we are wrestling with, but to really encourage those white students to really reflect on their own understanding and experiences, right? So when people ask me to sort of illustrate examples, I may provide that from my own sort of personal standpoint, but I appreciate that people are different in how much they show up in the classroom. I think my students would probably tell you that I'm an open book. I'm open for the conversation. That's not everyone. So I think you have to sort of figure out where your parameters are. But I do think the more vulnerable you are, I think the more you get out of the class. And I think teaching is an act of vulnerability, right? If I'm being honest in this conversation. So I think there's ways you can do that. Also think that you could sort of create space for people to sort of talk about the lived experience as legitimate knowledge, right? As they're trying to grapple with theory and ideas, right? That's how we make sense of the world. And so to not allow space for that is actually problematic.
I appreciate those perspectives, Lionel. I would just add that, I mean, I've worked with a lot of teacher educators who will have maybe a predominantly white class and lament the fact that there's no diversity in the class. And I think like, so there's no gender identity diversity, no sexual orientation diversity, socioeconomic, religion. I mean, we all live such intersectional lives. And so sometimes, you know, allowing students sort of saying, you can bring your whole self into the classroom, you can talk about your lived experiences, compare your lived experiences to the text. That's one level, but it's also the imagined student or imagined peer or friend. It doesn't have to be like a, thinking about like what could be other reasons why a child may behave in this way or why a family member may act in this way. And just using that as almost like a social cognitive exercise, it generates so many different perspectives without necessarily burdening people to disclose their own story, but maybe, stories of people they're close to in their lives.
Great, thank you. And following the classroom setting, we have a question about curriculum, and I'll point this to Brandon and Diamond. So is there still a place for Eurocentric and white American theories and development while bringing in multiple other voices and authors, or would you advocate for not teaching these theories that have been centered in the past?
Thank you for that question, Mariah. I can get us started. Is there a place for Eurocentric theories? Well, I guess I would argue that in many ways, the curriculum that's offered throughout universities in this country, at least, is always centering on a Eurocentric framework, right? And so I think in the spirit of unlearning and teaching to unlearn, that's often the place where we start, right? I think that it's important that we ground ourselves in the historical perspectives and consider the new and often overlooked frameworks that speak to issues of oppression and that are really putting together new ideas of intersectionality. I think that if we stay grounded in a Eurocentric perspective, this is absolutely limiting. And so by challenging ourselves to bring in new works, new writings by people of color, by scholars that have been activists, I think that this is really important. And if we're really considering what it means to provide a diverse and inclusive environment, we have to work toward that. It's important that we question, who are the authors in the readings that we have? Who are the people that we invite to speak? Of course, there will always be some lingering perspective that is Eurocentric. And I think that it's important that we call it out, that we name it. And so by acknowledging this, this is how we can grow into the classroom. So it's not to say that there isn't space, but rather to say that there's already so much space taken up by Eurocentric frameworks. This is something that we have to be conscious about. And so I think that building on that is really where we need to go. Again, taking a more critical approach will always include some kind of Eurocentric framework, but that's really the work here.
I just wanted to echo that, Diamond. I too agree that naming is probably one of the more important parts for me in terms of when we say Eurocentric theories. I don't think when we read theories that we think of it as a Eurocentric, right? But when we make assumptions about the generalizability of these developmental processes or emotional regulations, we often don't take into those cultural contexts because we assume those theories apply to everyone. But when we acknowledge and name that those theories predominantly sort of created by, with samples by white folks, from those perspectives, let's just call it what it is. Okay, that is what it is for white folks. What does that look like for these alternative different groups that have these different lived experiences and perspectives? So I really sort of resonated with that, Diamond. And so just want to really hammer that home.
Great, thank you. Lionel, would you like to take this?
Yes, thank you. So we're at the end of our time here. So I just want to thank my colleagues for just sharing perspectives and bringing your full selves to this conversation. It's been an honor and pleasure to work with each of you, and also just to thank SRCD headquarters. Very quickly, I want to remind our attendees that we have the upcoming diversity lecture series to be held December 8th from 2 to 4 p.m. And the title of that series is Constructing the Other: Two Complementary Perspectives on Discrimination, Social Exclusion, and Inequality. So please mark that on your calendars and plan to attend. Nihisti?
Thank you, Lionel. I would like to thank the panelists and all of you for joining us today. We will follow up with a link to the video recording of today's webinar and post it on SRCD's website. So please feel free to share it with your colleagues and others who might find it useful as well. We welcome your engagement on SRCD's online community platform, SRCD Commons. SRCD's Building an Anti-Racist Society community is a great space to discuss how developmental science can play an instrumental role in fostering anti-racism. We know many of you are interested in additional resources, and we will share additional resources on SRCD Commons. And lastly, we welcome your feedback on this webinar and invite you to complete a short survey if you have time. And from all of us from the Society for Research and Child Development, thank you very much for joining us today.